There is so much that we can cover inside Unity, and Unity itself could be the subject of, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 semesters of your work. But I'm just going to give you a brief overview of certain elements in Unity, kind of the essentials in Unity during the course of this module. I'm going to particularly be covering lighting, sound, things like that. Elements that really, are essential to any basic game prototype. Again, I'm not going to be diving super deep into scripting or creating complex systems. As you know, there's plenty of AAA titles made within Unity, and that's just really not for us. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into a couple different things in this video. In particular, how to create a proper scene in Unity. So scene files are located in the scenes folder in your assets, and scenes are basically, you can think of them as levels, right? We have this scene here, so this is scene 1, which is what's currently open, and we could save multiple variations of it. We could have different levels that we transition to, like scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, etc. And whenever we go to build our project, we'll choose which scenes we want to export, which scene is the default or starting scene, and how to bundle all of those together whenever we actually send this out into the world. So within a scene, we have a number of different elements. We have basically the character controller or the camera for the scene. So some scenes don't have a character controller. You could think of, for example, maybe a main menu or a credits sequence might just have a camera in it and not an actual controllable character. The scenes also could possibly have lights. Right here we have a directional light. They might have a ground surface, like we have this cube that's acting as a ground plane. And then they also have a skybox, and that's what we call this sort of infinitely large, repeating, procedurally generated sphere that we're inside right now. So you can kind of think of everything in the Unity scene, at least in Unity 3D, I'm talking specifically 3D for this class, not 2D, is existing within this kind of giant sphere of a sky. So this sky changes based on a number of factors, and we'll get into that into a different video, but I just want you to be aware of all these different components that make up a scene. Whenever we hit play, what's happening is the scene loads its start state, and we're then able to navigate around the scene. Scenes can be loaded and unloaded, they can be start and stopped, they can keep track of scores, they can have tons of different elements, so each kind of level of your game is a different scene. So now that we've talked about how scenes operate, let's talk about how we actually export a scene into a properly built game, and this is how you're going to start turning in work so that it can be experienced by others. So rather than just like screenshots like we did with the last project, we're going to start actually building out our project. So the best way to do this is to go to File, Build Settings. This is the same on Windows. And within the build settings, we have a bunch of different platforms we can export to. Depending on how you installed this Unity install, you can choose different things. We're going to go with PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Within that, we have different target platforms like Windows, Mac, and if you install the Linux libraries, you'll have Linux as well. There's a couple different options here. We don't really need to worry about those. The compression method, again, we don't need to worry about that. And then we have this Add Open Scenes button. So whenever I click that, it adds the currently open scene, which is scene 1. And that currently open scene is going to act as the starting level. So this 0 indicates that it's the first. We start counting from 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So maybe in the future, if we have another scene, I'm just going to go File, Save As, and save this scene as a second scene. Let's save it into our scenes folder, and I'll call it scene 2. Whenever I go to File, Build Settings, just notice that I only have scene 1 in here. I don't have my currently open scene 2, so I could add open scenes. So now I have 0 and 1. If I want to, for instance, not have scene 1 be loaded first, I could uncheck it. I can also reorder these. But largely this is, for turning in an assignment, you're probably only going to have one scene in this whole class. So I just want that checked. So I'm going to just hit Build. It's going to ask me where to save it into my project folder. You never want to build to an assets folder. That's really important. If we build it into our assets folder, it could possibly break our whole project. I like to personally make an entirely new folder and call it builds. And within that, I'll save this build as build 001, just so I know which one I'm building, and I'll hit save. Then Unity is going to go through a building the scene process, which could take some time depending on how complicated your scene is. I'm going to let that run. And once that's complete, we'll have a playable scene. All right, so it says build successful. And whenever I visit that folder on my computer, I now have the app file. If you're building for Windows, so let's say you're on a Windows machine and you hit this build, you're going to have a file, a .exe file, which is the executable, the actual game itself, and then you're going to have a folder that lives next to that file. That's the data files folder. That folder contains all the data for your game. Those have to stay next to each other, so if you're submitting, you need to zip those both together. In this case, I just have an app file for Mac, and like I said, you can build for Windows and build for Mac. You'll need to check with your instructor to see which version they prefer. But let's go ahead and test out our game, so I'll just open it up. I can choose a different graphics setting. I'm just going to pick windowed for now and hit play. And I can play my game and experience it. So to submit this online, I would just right-click it and compress. If I was on Windows, I would select both of the files that are generated in my builds folder, compress both of them together, and then submit that zip.